We don't know who the burger chef murderer was. That's the honest answer. The case is unsolved. It's one of the most haunting and frustrating cold cases in Indiana's history. 4 young people were killed on a November night in 1978, and for over 4 decades, their families, the police, and the public have been left with nothing but questions, theories, and dead ends. It's a story about a crime that seemed to happen in a vacuum, leaving behind almost no clues and a permanent scar on the town of Speedway. It was Friday, November 17th, 1978. The Burger Chef restaurant on Crawfordsville Road in Speedway, Indiana was getting ready to close. It was a typical night. The crew was mostly teenagers, working for pocket money, thinking about their weekend plans. On duty that night were 4 young employees. The assistant manager was Jayne Friedt. She was 20 years old. She was responsible and seen as the leader of the young crew. Daniel Davis was 16. He was a new employee still learning the ropes. Mark Flemmonds, also 16, worked the grill. He was a popular kid, a good student who also worked as a freelance photographer for a local paper. And then there was Ruth Shelton, who was 17. She was a friend of Jayne's and had a bright personality. They were just kids finishing a shift. Closing time was 11 p.m. Another employee stopped by the restaurant around 11:45 p.m. to see if his coworkers wanted to go out. When he got there, the place was empty. This was strange. The back door was unlocked. The lights were still on. On the counter, he saw Jayne's and Ruth's purses. In the office, the safe was open and empty. It looked like the crew had just vanished into thin air. He called the police. When the Speedway police arrived, they saw the same scene. No signs of a struggle, no blood, no obvious signs of violence. The restaurant was clean, maybe too clean. The cash drawers were on the floor, and about $581 was missing from the safe. That's not a lot of money, even for 1978. It hardly seemed like the motive for a quadruple kidnapping. The initial thought was that the kids had taken the money and run off to party. It was a Friday night, after all. This was a theory born of hope more than evidence. The police contacted the families, but no one had heard from them. As the hours ticked by, this theory started to fall apart. These weren't kids known for causing trouble. Jayne was a responsible manager. Mark, Daniel, and Ruth were good kids. They wouldn't just disappear, leaving their belongings behind without telling anyone. The feeling that something was terribly wrong began to set in. The police started a missing persons investigation. They searched the area. They talked to friends. They tried to piece together the last known moments of the 4 employees. The only real lead came from a witness, a 16-year-old boy who had been in the parking lot around closing time. He told police he saw 2 suspicious men in a car near the Burger Chef. He described one as being in his 30s, with a medium build, light-colored hair, and a neatly trimmed beard. The other man was younger, maybe around 20, clean-shaven, with dark, shaggy hair. The witness thought they might have been waiting for someone or casing the place. This description, especially the man with the beard, would become a central piece of the investigation for years to come. For 2 days, there was nothing. No calls, no ransom notes, no sign of the 4 kids. The families were frantic, the town was on edge, the hope that this was all a misunderstanding was fading fast. Then, on Sunday afternoon, the search came to a horrific end. A man walking through a wooded area in Johnson County, more than 20 miles south of the Burger Chef, found them. He discovered the bodies of the 4 employees scattered in the woods. The scene was brutal. The investigation now shifted from a kidnapping to a quadruple homicide. The autopsies revealed the sheer violence of the attack. Daniel Davis and Ruth Shelton had been shot multiple times with a .38 caliber firearm. Jayne Friedt had been stabbed twice in the chest, so violently that the blade of the knife had broken off and was still lodged in her body. When Mark Flemmonds had died from blunt force trauma, it seemed he had been bludgeoned, possibly with a chain or a similar object, while trying to run away. The manner of death for each victim was different. This puzzled investigators. It suggested either multiple killers with different weapons, or a single killer who was disorganized and frenzied. The violence seemed personal and excessive for a simple robbery gone wrong. Why not just take the money and leave? Why abduct 4 people, drive them 20 miles away, and execute them in such a varied and brutal fashion? The police were now facing a crime scene with almost no physical evidence. The restaurant had been wiped down. The killers had been careful, at least at the Burger Chef itself. The wooded area where the bodies were found offered little more. The police found a few shell casings from the .38, but not much else. Mark Flemmonds' car, a distinctive orange Chevrolet Vega, was also missing. It was later found parked in downtown Indianapolis. It too had been wiped clean of any useful prints. The investigation kicked into high gear. A massive task force was assembled with detectives from the Indiana State Police, Speedway Police Department, and Marion County Sheriff's Department. They chased down hundreds of leads, they interviewed friends, family, former employees, and known criminals. But they kept hitting a wall. The crime was so clean, so baffling. The public was terrified and captivated. The theories started to fly. Was it a robbery that went wrong? Did one of the kids recognize one of the robbers, forcing the criminals to eliminate all witnesses? This was the simplest and most plausible theory. The theft of $581 was the initial event, and the murders were a brutal, panicked attempt to cover it up. The witness description of the two men in the parking lot seemed to support this. Maybe they were small-time crooks who got in over their heads, but other theories emerged that were darker and more complex. One theory focused on a potential drug deal. Rumors swirled that Jayne Friedt's brother was involved in selling drugs and owed money to some dangerous people. According to this theory, the killers didn't come for the burger chef's money. They came for Jayne. The robbery was just a cover. They took her to send a message to her brother. The other three employees were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, witnesses who had to be silenced. This theory explained the targeted nature of the crime and the extreme violence directed at Jayne. It felt more personal than a random robbery. The police explored this angle thoroughly. They looked into the local drug scene and the people associated with it. This led them to a group of men from a nearby town. One man in particular became a person of interest. He vaguely matched the description of the bearded man. He had a reputation for violence, but there was no concrete evidence to link him or his associates to the crime. It was all circumstantial, based on rumors and jailhouse chatter. As the weeks turned into months, and months into years, the case grew cold. The initial flurry of activity died down. The task force was eventually disbanded. The case files, thick with dead-end leads and unproven theories, were put away. For the families of Jayne, Daniel, Mark, and Ruth, there was no closure. They were stuck in a nightmare, knowing their children had been murdered, but not knowing who did it or why. But the case was never truly forgotten. Every few years, a new detective would take a look at the files, or a reporter would write a story on the anniversary of the murders, bringing it back into the public eye. And with that attention, sometimes new information would surface. One of the most significant breaks, or what seemed like one, came in the mid-1980s. A man named Donald Forrester, who was in prison for an unrelated crime, began talking. He claimed to have been involved in the Burger Chef murders. Forrester told investigators a detailed story. He said he was part of a group that went to the Burger Chef that night to collect a debt from one of the employees, though his story about who owed the debt changed over time. He said things got out of hand. He named other men he claimed were with him. His confession seemed to align with some of the known facts of the case. He even led police to the woods where the bodies were found and pointed out specific locations. Investigators were cautiously optimistic. This could be the break they had been waiting for. But as they dug deeper into Forrester's story, it started to unravel. He failed a polygraph test. Key details in his account kept changing. He seemed to know things that only someone involved would know, but he also got basic facts wrong. Was he telling the truth, or was he a jailhouse informant looking for a deal, mixing real information with lies he'd picked up from other inmates or news reports? Ultimately, the prosecutor decided not to file charges against Forrester. There wasn't enough corroborating evidence to take his confession to trial. It was too risky. An acquittal would mean they could never charge him again for the crime. Forrester later recanted his confession, claiming he had been coerced by the police. The lead that had seemed so promising turned into another frustrating dead end. Around the same time, another man came forward. His name was Jeff Reed. He was a small-time criminal who claimed he was there that night. He provided a different version of events, one that connected back to the drug debt theory. He told a TV reporter that he had been outside the Burger Chef and witnessed the abduction. He said he saw a man with red hair, who was a known enforcer for a local drug ring, get into a dispute with one of the employees. But Reed's story was that this dispute escalated, leading to the kidnapping and murders. Reed's story also had problems. He too was a convicted felon with a credibility issue. His account had inconsistencies. He was given immunity in exchange for his testimony, but when it came time to testify before a grand jury, he clammed up. He refused to name the red-headed man or provide more details. Without his cooperation, this lead also went nowhere. The investigators were left with a tangled mess of conflicting stories, recanted confessions, and jailhouse rumors. They had the description of the bearded man and the clean-shaven man from the witness. They had Forrester's confession, which felt partially true but was ultimately unreliable. And they had Reed's story about a red-headed man and a drug debt, which also led to a dead end. One other name that came up over the years was Brett C. Kimberlin. He was a notorious figure in Speedway at the time, known as the Speedway Bomber. Just a week before the Burger Chef murders, a series of bombings had rocked the town. Kimberlin was eventually convicted for those bombings and spent years in prison. Because of the timing and his proximity to the Burger Chef, some speculated that he might have been involved. But his criminal style was completely different. Bombs are impersonal, the Burger Chef murders were brutally personal and hands-on. There was never any evidence linking Kimberlin to the crime, and he has always denied any involvement. He remains a footnote in the case, a what if that investigators looked at and dismissed. Years continued to pass. The Burger Chef restaurant itself was eventually torn down. A different business stands there now. The woods where the bodies were found have been developed. The physical locations of the crime have been erased by time, but the memory of the crime hasn't faded. In the 2000s, with advancements in forensic science, there was renewed hope. The Indiana State Police reopened the case. They had preserved the evidence from 1978, including the knife fragment from Jayne Friedt's chest and shell casings from the scene. They hoped that modern DNA technology could finally provide an answer. They submitted the items for testing. They tried to extract DNA from the handle of the knife and from any other trace evidence they had. The results were another disappointment. They were unable to recover a usable DNA profile from the evidence. The technology, as powerful as it is, couldn't overcome the limitations of evidence that was more than 2 decades old. It was another blow to the families and the investigators. However, the case wasn't closed. In 2018, the Indiana State Police held a press conference. They announced that they were still actively working the case and had made some progress. They revealed that they had been able to identify a man whose DNA was found at the crime scene. They did not name the man, but they said he was a person of interest who had since died. They also said they believed they knew the identity of the bearded man from the original witness description. This man was also dead. They were careful with their words. They did not call him a suspect, only a person of interest. They said they were trying to see if this man's DNA matched the sample from the scene. This announcement created a stir. It was the first significant public update in years. It suggested that the police were closer than ever to solving the crime, but since that press conference there has been silence. No follow-up announcements, no names released, no charges filed against any living accomplices. It's unclear if the DNA was a definitive match, or if it was just another promising lead that didn't pan out. The police have said that they don't want to release more information until they can definitively solve the case, to avoid jeopardizing the investigation or falsely accusing someone. So where does that leave us? We are left with a collection of strong suspects, none of whom can be definitively proven to be the killer. There's a theory of the robbery gone wrong carried out by the 2 men seen in the parking lot. Perhaps one of them was the bearded man the police believe they have identified. If they are both dead, it may be impossible to ever prove their guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. There's the drug debt theory, which many investigators have long believed is the most likely motive. This theory points to a specific group of local criminals. It would mean that Jayne Friedt was the primary target, and her co-workers were tragic collateral damage. Jeff Reed's story about the red-headed man fits into this theory. Donald Forrester's confession, which also mentioned a debt, could be a distorted version of these same events. It's possible that all these stories from Forrester and Reed are pointing to the same group of people, but a lack of credible, consistent testimony has prevented police from making an arrest. And there's the lingering possibility that it was someone else entirely, someone who was never on the police's radar. Someone who committed a monstrous act and then simply disappeared, living their life in anonymity while the families of the victims lived with unresolved grief. The Burger Chef murders are more than just a whodunit. It's a story about how a single night of violence can fracture a community and create ripples of pain that last for generations. The 4 victims were on the verge of their adult lives. Jayne Friedt was a young woman taking on responsibility. Daniel Davis was just starting his first job. Mark Flemmonds was a talented and ambitious young man. And Ruth Shelton was a high school student with a future ahead of her. Their lives were stolen for reasons we still don't understand. The question of who was the Burger Chef murderer is complicated because the answer might be plural. It was likely not one person. The logistics of controlling 4 people, driving them to a remote location, and killing them suggests at least 2 perpetrators, maybe more. It was likely a group of people. And who were they? They were likely local. They knew the area, they knew the back roads to get to the woods in Johnson County. They might have been small-time criminals involved in drugs and robbery. They were ruthless enough to kill 4 people to cover up a petty crime or settle a score. And they were lucky enough or careful enough to get away with it. They cleaned up after themselves. They left no fingerprints, no murder weapons, and no witnesses who could identify them for sure. The identity of the Burger Chef murderer or murderers is likely hidden in the contradictory stories of unreliable informants, in the memories of people who were too scared to talk in 1978, and in the microscopic traces of DNA that have so far refused to give up their secret. The police believe they are close, they may even be certain they know who did it, but knowing something and being able to prove it in a court of law are two very different things. Until there is a confession from a living accomplice, a new witness, or a definitive DNA match, the case will remain officially unsolved. The Burger Chef murderer remains a ghost, a nameless figure defined only by the brutal act he committed one cold November night. The only certainties in this case are the 4 young lives that were lost and the enduring mystery that surrounds their deaths. We don't know who the killer was, and we may never know, and that is perhaps the most tragic part of this whole story.